Our final Learning Lounge session for today is Blitz on Successful Marketing to Canada. From Northern Response International, Daniel Lai, and from Thane Direct Canada Inc., Patty Booth.
Hi, everyone. So before I start, I just wanted to reference a white paper that actually the ERA published earlier this year. It's about doing business in Canada. I would recommend you reference that when you get a chance. It provides you with a lot of action items and details as to how you want to penetrate the Canadian marketplace, whether you're looking to come in direct or working through a distributor or marketer. Today's session, we're going to focus more on a high-level overview and really focus on some of the sales channels and opportunities available. And we'll identify also some of the regulatory bodies and compliance topics that you should be aware of. So Canada, as the second largest country in the world, has a comparative population that is smaller than the state of California. So just to temper your expectations about sales and how they would translate from the US market up to Canada, 25% of our population, who mostly reside in the province of Quebec, speak French. In terms of population dispersion, most of our residents live close to the US border. So we're not really an Arctic country in that most of us live in a temperate climate. And if you look at any of the major cities like Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto, Montreal, we all hover along the US border. In terms of GDP, we've had the strongest GDP growth, or GDP numbers, I should say, in general, since the financial crisis of any G8 nation. That being said, we are closely tied to the economy here in the US. So as the recovery here in the US gains momentum, you'll definitely see us riding the coattails. In terms of credit rating, we're AAA, just like any Scandinavian country or Australia or Hong Kong, which means it's a stable business environment. And lastly, we're a trading nation. So contrasted to the US, where probably 70% of the GDP is generated from domestic spending, whether that be public, private, or consumer spending. Most of our GDP, given our small population, is generated from trade with other nations, most importantly being the US, where 70% of our trade takes place. And the last little trend that we see of the last 5 years is this dollar parity. With technology, now that we can readily see prices of the same goods being sold in Canada versus US, there is an expectation that there's better bang for your buck as a Canadian. Otherwise, you're going to force a lot more cross-border shopping.
Hi, everyone. The first few bullet points on the media environment that I'd like to speak to are about the DR time that's available in Canada. So you can come into Canada, buy the media yourselves, or you can go through a distributor or a media agency. It's difficult on a short-term basis to come in and buy media by yourself from your own individual company if you don't already have a relationship with the group of stations that run most of the media in Canada. The time available for infomercials in our environment in Canada is very limited. We have Canadian content restrictions that pares down the number of hours available to infomercial time. As a result, most of the time that is available for infomercial media is already contracted out to media agencies or individual companies. So if you to be successful in Canada in this environment, you need to be able to buy media, so often you will have to come to somebody in Canada who is already doing it, at least on a short-term basis. It used to be many years ago, there was only short-time media available for DRTV, then it morphed into infomercial media being the biggest area to work in. Now it's moving back more to, there's still lots of infomercial time available, but short form is becoming much bigger part of the marketing strategy with most companies, and that's because in the end, retail is really where the end game for our company and many others. The number of stations is very limited. I think I just hit the...
Yeah, it's all pulled up.
Okay. The number of stations that we have about approximately 10% of the media the stations available. compared to the US. Virtually all of those stations you can run short form direct response, and approximately 80% of the stations there is infomercial time available. Per minute, just because of the smaller number of stations that do run infomercials and media in general, per minute it's more expensive to buy media in Canada. On the flip side, the response rates are usually higher compared to the US. The French market in Canada, as Daniel mentioned, it's 25% of Quebec is 25% of the population in the country. And if a product is successful and you want to be 100% successful across the country, you definitely want to be buying media in Quebec. French creative is required. Quebec, well, we'll get into some of the regulatory later, but Quebec has it's not its own country, although it has tried to be on many occasions, but it operates in a very different way in their regulatory environment.
So I'm going to talk about the commercials itself, the infomercials. You have to apply to the TVB, which is Television Bureau of Canada. They will issue you a telecaster number. This process takes, depending on how many back and forths you need to go to be compliant with your show, but it costs around $400 to $500. And if you visit their website, they have all the details that you need to be compliant. In terms of the actual creative, if you're wondering if anything needs to be tweaked on your messaging, on your branding, vis-a-vis your US campaign, the answer is no. We are closely economically integrated with the US. As I mentioned, most Canadians live close to the US. There's a lot of cross-pollination that takes place. We average around 50 million visits down to the US, most of it for day trips, cross-border shopping. Canadian retail loses about $21 billion a year, with Canadians going down price hunting in the US. The main change, as we've talked about, you need to dub your infomercial into French in order to air in Quebec. And that is about it. Besides that, it's plug and play. If you look at any other traditional advertising or DR advertising, nobody changes the creative coming into Canada, and they have been able to replicate the success that they've seen in the US coming into Canada.
All right, next area for Canadian being successful marketing in Canada is the live shopping environment. It's very small. There used to be a small Quebec sort of live shopping station, but it's gone away. It closed shop in August. But there is a group called the Shopping Channel. It's owned by a large company called Rogers Communications. Operates very much like HSN and QVC, so it's a wholesale account basically. The sales to the Shopping Channel are virtually like a consignment sale. So the product sells through, and it's again similar to QVC and HSN. So if the product sells well and you have sell through on air that day, the product gets shipped usually next day from the Shopping Channel. But if it doesn't sell through, we usually end up, or the vendor usually ends up with it coming back fairly quickly. So you want to make sure before you go into the Shopping Channel that you've got a good strategy to be able to sell the product if it does come back. Hopefully you don't have that problem, but obviously it will happen with many items. The Shopping Channel's 18-hour live shopping, and then overnight they're running reruns. They have approximately 25 million viewers, so almost approximately 75% of the country. And they process 10,000 orders per day, much smaller than HSN or QVC, but it's still within the Canadian market. It's a big player, and it's part of the mix for us to be able to sell products once we're in infomercial, short form, live shopping, some other smaller wholesale accounts. It helps to build up the awareness for the product, and it is a profitable wholesale account.
The retail environment, this for Northern Response is our bread and butter. So Target, this is the big news for 2013, came into Canada this year. They're up to 82 stores, on track to open 124 by year end. This is the most aggressive penetration by a foreign retailer into Canada since Walmart entered the marketplace in '94. There's one main trend that's happening in retail with two underlying drivers I'm going to cover. With U.S. chains coming in, they're a lot bigger, obviously. So the Canadian incumbents have been forced to consolidate and to increase their economies of scale. So part of this bulking up, we've seen this year, for instance, Loblaws, which is our largest grocery chain, acquired Shoppers Drug Mart, which is our largest pharmacy chain, for over $12 billion earlier this year. And also Sobeys purchased Safeway Canada to become now the second largest grocery chain in Canada. And that was for $6 billion earlier this year. The other trend that we're seeing, or driver of this trend, is Canada, for the most part, aside from Saskatchewan and Alberta, is a zero growth market. So if it's zero growth and you can't grow organically, you look to acquire or merge with other former competitors. So Lowe's was a late entrant into Canada. Home Depot is already well established. They're a top 5 retailer in Canada by revenues. Lowe's last year tried to acquire Rona to gain some instant market share, but that deal ultimately fell through. In terms of how US chains are faring in Canada, they're very dominant. Top 3 or top 4 by revenues in terms of retailers in Canada are US based, Walmart being by far the most successful with over $22 billion in revenues. Costco is a far second at $13 billion. Last little tidbit, in terms of retail space, also known as gross leasable area, we know that Canada is 10% of the population in the US, but in terms of available retail space, we're less than 5% of what is available in the US. This is most evident, for instance, when you go to a small town in the US, contrasted to Canada. There are a lot more big box stores in that small town in the US versus the comparable Canadian town where there might be 1 or 2 stores in there. My last point would be, as seen on TV products for retail, if they've not yet come into Canada but are well established both on the media front as well as retail in the US, retail buyers in Canada would already be familiar with these items, as well as consumers in some cases may already be demanding them as well before anyone even pitches it in the Canadian marketplace.
And probably the most boring part of the discussion is the regulatory environment, but very important. Many similarities to the US as well. The privacy laws are similar to the US, but there are nuances that if you are marketing in Canada, you need to be familiar with that, with our privacy law. There are some changes that are coming into play in the next few months as well in Canada. So it's just staying on top of of that specific legislation is important. A couple of years ago, we also had a new law that came into play, the Canadian Consumer Product Safety Act, and the U.S. has had a similar law for many years. Ours is very much like the U.S. law, but more stringent. Penalties are higher. And again, I won't go into a lot of detail on it, but it is something that if you are marketing in Canada, it's very important to be up to speed on what the issues and regulations are around the CCPSA law. The Competition Bureau in Canada is basically our version of the FTC. So they tend to follow suit with, if the FTC is bringing suit against marketers in the U.S. Over certain claims or ingredients, ingredients would be FDA, but the Competition Bureau pretty much follows suit. If there's something that's happened in the U.S., you can expect to see the Competition Bureau going after the same companies or the same types of claims with companies in Canada. Health Canada is very similar to FDA and polices that side of the health and beauty, pharmaceuticals, nutraceuticals, and so on. Tax laws, they're not as complicated as they are in the U.S. We don't have 9,800 different taxes in Canada, but there are different tax requirements by province and territory and federally. Language laws, this is quite different in Canada from the U.S. There are very stringent language laws, especially if your product is being sold in Quebec, and they must be abided by. And I think that's all Daniel and I have. If there are any questions, we'd be happy to answer them for you. Thank you.